again. It's great to have you all with us for today's SCORE Institute on the future of outcomes-based funding in higher education in Tennessee. I'm David Mansuri. I have the honor of serving as the president and CEO of SCORE. And as many of you know, SCORE's mission is to drive bold changes that transform education so that all Tennessee students are prepared for success. And we work as an organization to advance student-focused policy, support and invest in innovative leaders and practices, pilot and scale promising proof points, and use data and research to expand opportunity from K-12 through post-secondary and workforce readiness. And one of our key goals as an organization is to ensure that every student has the opportunity to earn a credential or degree that will enable economic independence. And so with this goal in mind, we're excited to host today's conversation because we see this topic as a tremendous potential opportunity. The topic of post-secondary funding has a potential and really tremendous opportunity to grow Tennessee's talent pipeline, to strengthen our workforce as a state, and to expand economic opportunity for every Tennessean. Strengthening the connection between post-secondary credentials and economic opportunity is a top priority for Tennessee. It's a top priority, I know, for many of you. And we know, and the reason why is that we know that education is the foundation of economic development. And we believe that aligning our post-secondary funding formula as a state to this goal is essential to build a better future for students and for Tennessee. So Tennessee has long been heralded as a national leader when it comes to post-secondary education and to funding post-secondary education based on student outcomes, a practice that a majority of states have since adopted. The outcomes-based funding formula in Tennessee that was created by state legislation in 2010 casts a vision for student success and rewards public colleges and universities for making progress towards that vision, emphasizing student completion of degrees and not just student enrollment. Tennessee has seen some progress in completion rates improving for students, yet as we'll spend some time discussing today, there's more work to be done to ensure that every student truly has the opportunity to earn credentials or degrees that enable economic independence. And in recent weeks, the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, the state's coordinating body for higher education that administers the outcomes-based funding formula in higher education, has begun its comprehensive review of the formula. And this is a really significant opportunity to make needed changes to the formula that occurs only once every 5 years. So now is the time to ensure that the formula that we have in Tennessee is driving students to careers that sustain families and strengthen Tennessee's economy. And so we're excited to dig deeper into this important opportunity with you all today at this SCORE Institute. So for a quick overview of our agenda, we'll kick off today's Institute with an overview of how Tennessee's outcomes-based funding formula currently works, followed by SCORE's key recommendations to strengthen the formula's alignment to economic opportunity. And then we'll have a panel discussion with several distinguished national leaders who have deep expertise and experience in the opportunity and potential of state post-secondary funding formulas. And then finally, we'll close by sharing a few resources with you to learn more and join us in advocating for a formula that drives economic opportunity for every student in Tennessee. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Aaliyah Guthrie, SCORE's Vice President of Policy and Government Relations, to provide some helpful historical context about Tennessee's approach to post-secondary funding and to walk through SCORE's recommendations for this current formula review cycle. And Aaliyah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, David. So as David shared, we're going to start with sort of a crash course on the formula itself and then dig into SCORE's recommendations for how we believe that the outcomes-based funding formula can be strengthened after already a decade of strong work. So building on what David has already shared, I want to just acknowledge Tennessee has long been a leader in higher ed policy. So over the last 15 years, Tennessee has taken many bold steps to expand post-secondary access, economic opportunity. It's really starting in 2010 with the Complete College Tennessee Act, which is when the outcomes-based funding formula was established. And then the Tennessee Drive to 55. So this goal of 55% attainment ushered in a decade of focus on increasing post-secondary attainment. And it was supported with initiatives like Tennessee Promise and the Give Grants, Apprenticeships Tennessee, and even really recently, significant investments in technical colleges and workforce training programs. And so these efforts over this period of time have contributed to a steady rise in post-secondary attainment. And currently, so the most recent data we have is 2023. About 49% of Tennesseans hold a post-secondary credential or degree, and that's compared to 33% when the Drive to 55 first started. So very significant progress, and yet a critical gap still remains between attainment and the jobs that will require a post-secondary degree or credential in the years to come. Updated labor market data shows that by 2031, 63% of jobs in Tennessee will require some type of post-secondary training. So beyond the data that we're looking at here, there's also a question about those 49% of Tennesseans who do have a post-secondary credential, whether that credential or degree is actually going to be the type of credential or degree that will lead them to a path of high wage job and economic independence. And so that's really something that SCORE has been very focused on. And looking deeper into the data, we see in Tennessee about half of the credentials earned are linked to a high demand occupation. And post-secondary education, on average, does provide significant earning and employment benefits, but there's a wide range in the earnings by credential type and especially by program. And so students are facing a really complex landscape, and not all of the options in front of them are going to deliver sustaining results for their careers long term. So this led SCORE to create something in partnership with 20 state leaders from higher education, K-12 education, industry, economic and workforce development. And this impact credential framework was released in a report last year. And at the end of this institute, we'll be sure to share a QR code so that you can dig into this report. But what we're seeking to do is to develop a framework to evaluate the economic impact of the credentials and degrees offered in Tennessee. And it establishes a common definition for degrees and credentials that will set students up for success based on 3 measures. So earnings, job outlook, and stackability. And then it's designed to recognize 3 tiers of impact across those measures. So essentially, our work on impact credentials is really a first step. We want for students to have confidence that the degree or credential that they're pursuing will lead to economic independence. And we believe that the outcomes-based funding formula is a really relevant and an important lever for advancing that. So that's why we're going to talk about outcomes-based funding formula today. We believe that the way we fund our institutions matters, and not only does that funding matter because it directly impacts students, it also reflects the values and priorities of our state that then can drive institution behavior. So just to kind of take a step back, we want to first clarify, what do we mean by post-secondary funding based on outcomes? It's exactly what it sounds like. So post-secondary institutions receive public dollars based on student outcomes like credit accumulation or degree attainment. This is relatively new in the history of higher ed. As I said, Tennessee established our outcomes-based funding formula in 2010. But this is very different than traditional approaches of funding institutions based on enrollment or base cost, base plus approaches. Those approaches really struggle to address differences between institutions, and they also don't incentivize completion. And in contrast, outcomes-based funding can accommodate for institutional differences. It can make sure that completion is what is prioritized, and it is more nimble and able to be aligned to what the state is prioritizing more broadly. So OBF, outcomes-based funding, stands apart because it essentially holds institutions accountable for delivering results for students. And it is now how most states across the country are funded to varying degrees. And Tennessee was an early adopter. We invest a greater share of institution funding in the formula than other states. And we do that for both community colleges and for public universities. So three sort of central considerations for why we think the outcomes-based funding formula is an important lever for driving impact credentials. First is that this is a lever to advance a state priority. We know that our state is prioritizing workforce development, and this 5-year review cycle is an opportunity for the formula to shift as those state priorities have evolved. Second, the formula is intended to incentivize and hold accountable institutions, and it also can provide support to colleges and universities so that they can shift their practices. And finally, outcomes-based funding is a really powerful state lever. So I mentioned before that we invest a greater percentage or a greater share in institution funding through the formula than other states. It's roughly 80%, and it's about $1.4 billion. So this is a really important lever that we should be sure that that funding is really sending the right signal and targets that are going to support economic independence for students and contribute to the state's economy. Okay, so how does our formula work? In Tennessee, the formula rewards institutions for improvement relative to their peers, and institutions generate points across a range of outcomes. So there are 20 outcomes, and then there are 4 focus populations, so 24 components total. And then once institutions have earned those points, they go through a scaling and weighting process, and then it's averaged over 3 years, and an institution's relative improvement or growth as compared to other institutions then determines the funding or the share of funding that it receives. And while it has 24 components, only 3 of them are connected to workforce opportunity or economic opportunity. We think that that's important. That's a good start. But even those three components don't reflect earnings or long-term employment prospects. And so these are some of the components in the formula that we're really interested in sort of modernizing and updating during this revision process of the outcomes-based funding formula. And we heard from institution leaders when we spoke to about 40 different institution leaders. This was during the summer of 2024. We conducted a learning tour. And what we heard is that many institution leaders, they don't think about the formula to drive their decision-making in a significant way. And some of the reasons that were shared is the design features of the formula, including the complexity and number of components that really lessens their ability to focus on any individual target. And so our recommendations today are going to really flow out of those 2 findings about the alignment of the formula to workforce need and the ability for institutions to actually make strategies and drive behavior based on the formula. So SCORE has 2 recommendations. The first is to reimagine the current high need premium to a tiered impact credential bonus. And the second recommendation is to streamline the formula in order to maximize the impact on institution behavior. So let's talk about the first, the high need premium. So this list of components that we just went through, there is in the focus population, there is the high need field focus population, sometimes called the workforce investment premium. And this plays a central role. It was just introduced in 2023. It awards points when a student completes one of those other outcomes if they are in a degree or credential that is considered high need. So how the focus population premiums work, all of those 4 that we just talked about, when a student attains a credential in the formula, they earn 1 point. But if that student is a part of a focus population, they generate an 80% premium. So that 1 point becomes 1.8 points, and it has a compounding effect. So if a student qualifies for an additional focus population, then the premium stacks on each other up to 140% or 2.4 points. So just as another example to share, if a community college student was academically unprepared, low income, and an adult, and then they earned a credential that was in a high need field, they would generate 2.4 points for that community college. So how is the high need premium defined? The high need premium's current definition, as I said, it just was established in 2023. It awards more points to institutions when a credential is in one of these 9 broad categories. So these broad fields of study are defined by a 2-digit zip code, and you'll see it's mostly STEM and healthcare programs. And so any program of study that falls within one of these 9 fields is considered high need. And this broad definition captures about a third of all the credentials earned in Tennessee and about half of all programs offered. And when we look at, specific programs, some of them maybe aren't a surprise, like an RN, but others you may not think of as high need, like animal grooming or athletic trainers. Something as broad as a 2-digit zip code, that broad field of study like health or agriculture. It means it's going to capture some of those programs, which may not actually have earnings and demand data that reflect that it is actually high need. It's just that is a field that is high need. And so we think we need a better definition. The high need premium, we looked at it relative to the impact credential framework that I was just describing before. That is a tiered framework based on earnings, job outlook, and stackability. And more than half of the programs that are currently identified as high need actually can't be linked to a growing high wage job opportunity. So that's what you'll see in blue. And we also know on the flip side that there are programs that students are participating in and institutions are offering and that they're completing that actually are aligned to earnings and job outlook. And they're currently not being incentivized in the formula because of the high need premium definition. And so what we're recommending is a better definition that actually captures the economic opportunity of a credential or a degree. So excited about this sort of 2-part recommendation to reimagine the premium that would advance impact credential attainment. The first is around shifting the premium, how it functions in the formula. So actually moving it out of the focus population list, and instead it would be an independent step in the process. It would be a bonus. And we think that's important because it would increase the focus of economic opportunity, making it its own component. It would allow for more adjustments to the weights of that component that wouldn't necessarily have to alter the weighting of those other focus populations. And it would also ensure that institutions are truly incentivized to help students finish an impact credential, and especially for the students that their lives would be most transformed by the completion of an impact credential. So those higher need students. So shifting how the premium functions so that it would be a bonus on top of the other focus populations. And then, as I was just describing, updating the definition to actually reflect a tiered impact credential. Okay, and then our second recommendation is to streamline the metrics in OBF. So you saw this chart before. This is all of the components of the formula, and we think there are several opportunities to revise and to streamline. And so those are specifically credit accumulation, the dual enrollment metrics, job placement, and the 2 completion-related outcomes, graduation rate and degrees per FTE. So the first opportunity is to refocus dual enrollment. So dual enrollment, really important part of a high school student's experience, to give them access to post-secondary and to earn credit. Currently, institutions are rewarded in the formula for student enrollment, but not student achievement or intentional progression towards a degree or credential of impact. So Tennessee could shift the definition for the dual enrollment metric from just tracking participation to really emphasizing successful completion of courses that align with those pathways that are on an impact towards an impact credential. The second opportunity is to revisit the job placement outcome. This outcome, while aligned in some ways, it rewards institutions when graduates secure full-time employment. This metric does not consider in criteria like earnings or a job outlook. Replacing this with an impact credential bonus, as we talked about before. So redefining a high need premium and establishing a bonus structure that would better connect the education that students are receiving and the employment opportunity through the formula. The third opportunity is to streamline the formula's 6 credential credit accumulation metrics, excuse me. These are about 30% of all of the outcomes in the formula, and consolidating these 6 different outcomes into one per sector, so one for community college and one for our four-year institutions, would help to streamline the formula, but it would also send a stronger signal about early momentum toward credential completion rather than taking up such a large percentage of all outcomes. And a single benchmark, 15 credits for community colleges or 30 credits for universities, would more effectively reinforce the importance of early student success. And then finally, graduation rate. So we're excited about the opportunity to improve graduation rate in the university sector. Currently the formula uses a 6-year graduation rate for universities, which doesn't incentivize on-time completion. There is an additional degrees per 100 FTE outcome, which is redundant given that institutions are already rewarded for degree completion through the graduation rate and credential outcome. So updating the graduation rate to a 4-year measure and removing the degrees per FTE, 100 FTE for universities would more directly support the goal of on-time completion and reward institutions when students are earning credentials and entering the workforce. So as I said, our two priorities are to reimagine the definition of high need premium and to streamline the formula. But we know that there are other steps that are needed. After a formula change, there are improvements that Tennessee has to make to support institutions. So we hope that what will follow is development of outcomes-based funding modeling tools, resources to support institutions to shift practice and really equip them to implement it well. And then to leverage, we also know there are many data enhancements needed to, this would require work across state agencies to ensure that the occupation code collection, data around non-degree credentials is better understood so that in the future we could incorporate that into our formula definitions. So thank you so much for this kind of quick rundown of the formula, the history of post-secondary policy in Tennessee, and then some of the opportunities we see in this cycle. I'm going to turn it over to Mary Cypress Metz, who is going to lead us through a panel of experts that we've assembled. We're really excited about this group of national leaders. And so thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it to you, Mary Cypress.
Thank you, Aaliyah, and thank you for walking us through those recommendations and the overview. And we are excited to next turn to some of the national experts who really kind of know deeply outcomes-based funding formulas and how higher education funding can connect to economic opportunity for students and for states. And we're really excited to dig in on this with you all today. And so I am glad to welcome Ray Martinez, Sean Tierney, and Kenyatta Lovett, who are going to join me for a conversation for the next few minutes. And I would love for y'all to introduce yourselves. And maybe Kenyatta, we'll start with you because you're first on my screen, but would love for you to introduce yourself and your background, and also just give us a quick overview of why you think outcomes-based funding is an opportunity for student success.
Sure. And good morning, everyone. And thanks for having me. Kenyatta Lovett, principal at Education Strategy Group. I lead our higher education and workforce development practice, but see a lot of familiar faces In the group that's here, formerly in Tennessee and now in Texas with my good colleague Ray, who's on this panel with me. But would say that we're proudly supporting right now our work around attainment and value, or I'm sorry, value and return on investment with about nearly 10 states across the nation. So this movement is picking up steam. I want to say, I know Ray will cover the role of House Bill 8 and what Texas has been doing, but obviously Tennessee in 2010 embarked on this journey some time ago. What's really important right now, I think that we find to be exciting is the evolution of data capabilities. And I think that's what this conversation is about. When I think about the conversation in 2010, a lot of the data capabilities were not there to track what you're mentioning. And what I'll say is, as Tennessee embarks on a new strategic higher education master plan, we just released a report called The Great Value Shift. And one of the things that we highlighted is that state leaders need to coalesce around a goal. And as THEC, the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, begins to land on where the state should go next, obviously, to your point, Mary Cypress, the outcomes-based funding formula should align with that. And I think the transformation at the institutional level will be the exciting part of where Tennessee goes next. But good to see everyone, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Kenyatta. And Ray, I'll turn to you next.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Mary Cypress, and my thanks to David and Aaliyah as well, and to Tennessee SCORE for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. I'm glad to be here on a panel with my longtime and very good friend Kenyatta, and of course Sean with the Arnold Ventures, and looking forward to our discussion. So I serve Ray Martinez. I serve as president and CEO of the Texas Association of Community Colleges. We are a 501c6 entity here in Austin. In Texas, we don't have a statewide system for our community colleges. So in a sense, our association, Texas Association of Community Colleges, or TAC as we call ourselves, is essentially the voice and the face of our 50 community college districts across the state of Texas. We're the largest sector. Community colleges in Texas are the largest sector of higher education. We have about 745,000 students enrolled across our 50 community college districts. I think for us, we think about outcomes-based funding very strategically, and we actually learned a lot from Tennessee's experience when we were working for a year through a commission that was formed back in 2022 to look at the funding model for our community colleges in Texas. We studied very closely what Tennessee had been doing since 2010, Ohio, and other states who were early adopters of an outcomes-based or performance-based funding model. What I've heard even this morning is very insightful. I want to learn more about the recommendations from SCORE. Our legislature in 2023, just a little over 2 years ago, passed our funding model, what we call House Bill 8, and it transformed funding for our 50 community college districts away from a contact hour or enrollment-based funding model and immediately towards a 100% outcomes-based funding model. And later in the conversation, I can talk in details about that. But I think, to start this conversation, I would just say that the Texas legislature and our state leadership, and especially our community colleges across the state, were looking to ensure that we could better align post-secondary outcomes from our community colleges, whether that's an academic credential or a workforce education credential, to better align our outcomes with the current but also emerging needs of business and industry across the state of Texas. House Bill 8 was a workforce education bill at its heart, and that's really what drove a lot of our decision making around changing our funding model, and not delaying that change, by the way, making the change and immediately within months moving away from a funding model that had been in place for decades towards one that was purely outcomes-based funding. So look forward to diving into further details in this discussion.
Thank you, Ray. And we look forward to learning more about Texas's work as we go through the conversation. But Sean, I'll let you close this out with introductions.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be on this esteemed panel and part of this conversation. I'm Sean Tierney, Director of Higher Ed Policy at Arnold Ventures, State Policy. Arnold Ventures is a national philanthropy based in Houston, but Tennessee is one of our priority states, and we are very engaged in helping higher education figure out how to improve value and ROI to both students and the taxpayers. And I think that's one of the really exciting things about outcomes-based funding. Tennessee is a national leader, as we've all heard this morning, on outcomes-based funding. And one of the things that it's always kind of kept front and center is how to improve outcomes for the students, and how to maximize that tax dollar to make sure that taxpayers get the most bang for their buck, and doing so through figuring out how to help more students complete, more students get the types of credentials that are going to pay off and lead to long-term sustainability. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sean. And so want to dig in some more now. And in this conversation and through the recommendations that Aaliyah just walked through, we're really thinking about how can an outcomes-based funding formula really help to drive economic opportunity for Tennessee, for students, for our state. And so would love to do one more lightning round, and we'll go kind of in the same order of why do you think that outcomes-based funding is a lever to drive economic opportunity? And would love to kind of hear briefly from each of y'all, and then we're going to dive in a little more. But Kenyatta, we'll start with you.
Sure, and I'll go back to the beginning in 2010 with the Complete College Tennessee Act. The one thing that I was very exciting and unusual was the buy-in and support of employers. They had a different, lever or handle to work with higher education when you're talking outcomes versus enrollment. And I just recall a conversation with someone at the Nashville Chamber of Commerce during that time of asking the question that we're still trying to answer today. And the question was, great, that we're going to provide more degrees and credentials out there in the state of Tennessee, but will they be the right degrees and credentials for employers? But nonetheless, I think employers have been the exciting part of it. And now that we're into this new era, I think there's even more conversation to be had about where they lean in and thinking about economic mobility and economic prosperity for students. I would say the same for, I'm looking to Ray in Texas, that the employer community was a very vocal and supportive element of that conversation. And so, again, outside of, as Aaliyah highlighted, when you're talking enrollment, there's a very small group of individuals that can have that conversation or a different table. When you're talking attainment, obviously you bring in a lot more leaders and stakeholders. Now that we're talking about economic mobility and economic prosperity, I think there's going to be a nice and healthy ecosystem of leaders that can support institutions in sort of delivering a new frontier of performance and outcomes for the state.
Thanks, Kenyatta. Ray, we'll turn to you next.
Yeah, well, I think that I agree with Kenyatta. I mean, for us, as we made the transformation away from an antiquated funding model that was not responding to the needs of business and industry across the state, we couldn't do that without ensuring that the employer industry perspective was helping to drive that conversation. So the commission that we formed through legislation in 2022, which was the precursor to passing House Bill 8 a year later, was actually led by a very prominent business leader out of El Paso. Woody Hunt is his name. It had representation not just of our sector, both our administrators, so presidents and chancellors, also some we elect our governing board members here in Texas. So we have 400 plus trustees that are locally elected officials that govern our 50 community college districts. So we had representation from all of the relevant stakeholders, but business and industry was at the table. And I think, again, just very quickly, because I know this is sort of a lightning round question. I mean, we looked at data, whether it is data, whether it's Illumina source data or for the Center for Education and Workforce at Georgetown University, or perhaps even most relevant, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. In 2023, the Dallas Fed issued reports called All Eyes on Texas, and it was focused on essentially the economic impact of community colleges on Texas. And what there are many takeaways from that report, one of which was that the Dallas Fed said that over the next 5 years through 2030, and this was in 2023, so at that time, over the next 7-year period, more than 4 million new jobs were expected to be created in Texas, but many, if not most of those jobs would be jobs that require middle skill attributes of our graduates. And what does that mean? Well, it means graduates who have more than a high school diploma, but not necessarily all the way up to a bachelor's degree. Those middle skill jobs we have more than 1 million available. And what sector of higher education can best respond to that particular need in Texas? It is our community colleges. That is our sweet spot. We do have many of our community colleges in Texas that do offer some applied bachelor degrees, but by and large, we are workforce education. We are associate degrees in many different relevant fields. So the legislature looked at our sector to say, if Texas will remain a thriving economy, leading the nation as we usually do in GDP growth or low unemployment, things like that. Now the eighth largest, soon to be the seventh largest economy in the world. We cannot do it by having a mismatch or misalignment of the skills that our employers and industry need with what we're producing out of particularly our community colleges. So we made the change to an outcomes-based funding model. And I'll stop there for now. Mary Cypress.
Thanks, Ray. And I look forward to digging back in. I'm glad data keeps coming up, and I'm also looking forward to coming back to thinking about how the formula is helping to drive thinking at the institution level and some of that. But Sean, let's close out with you.
Sure. I think one of the many things Tennessee can be proud of is not only innovating on funding formula, starting in the 70s with performance funding, then innovating outcomes-based funding around 2010, but that the state doesn't rest on its laurels, right? Just because it's created new funding formulas and ways to fund higher ed doesn't mean that it kind of slows down. And building on some of the pieces that all three of you all have mentioned today, some of that is as the needs of higher education and as the needs of the state change, right? Like you go from funding for accreditation to funding for enrollment to completions. And now, as Kenyatta mentioned, like now we've got better data. As Ray mentioned, now we kind of need a little bit more alignment with the workforce. Now there's talk of trying to figure out how to improve funding or change funding to improve credentials of value. So that all starts with making sure that students have the support that they need to complete, and that institutions have a clear message or directive from the state on what is it that the state values. And then three, kind of figuring out how to align all of those incentives, both from the messaging and funding piece, to help institutions provide those supports to help students get those credentials that they need.
Thanks for that, Sean. And I want to stick with you because a lot of the work that Arnold Ventures has supported and you've been involved in throughout the course of your career has been around kind of the research around different higher ed policies and things like that. And I would love for you to share with a little bit about what does research show us about the impact of outcomes-based funding on student opportunity, on economic opportunity. I would love to just start with the research piece there.
Yeah, that's music to our ears because Arnold Ventures is very much an evidence-first organization. The difficult part with outcomes-based funding, though, is it's innovative and it's a really niche field. And I think Tennessee also has an especially difficult road because of being in the place of an innovator. You often don't get to learn from other states, and so you've got to sort of try things out and experiment. And so for the research itself, it's a little bit mixed when you look at it from the big picture, but you've got to drill down in two ways. First, you've got to differentiate outcomes-based funding from the alternative, right? We are not funding in a vacuum. And so thinking through, how does this compare to the old way? One of my favorite quotes in policy is, and it's a quintessentially New Jersey quote. New Jersey started looking at their funding formula, and their official report, after months and months of, a blue ribbon panel, said the funding is just not based in any sort of reasonable method. And that left a lot of students really struggling to get through the higher education system. And so one of the things that the research is starting to show is that an outcomes-based funding formula, even if not perfect, is often better than a confused sort of lobbying, advocacy-led funding policy or an enrollment-driven policy. The second piece is um, differentiating between well-designed outcomes-based funding formula and poorly designed ones. And one of my big gripes with a lot of research these days is that they tend to lump a lot of outcomes-based funding formulas all together, and that's really just sort of a due to just sort of the way the methodology sometimes has to play. But it can be difficult to kind of differentiate between like a well-designed Tennessee formula and I'm not going to name a state, but a poorly designed formula in another state. And so all told, though, when you kind of drill down enough, you start to see that although there are no direct links, you can't just say like this extra dollar has promoted this extra completion. You can see over time how you start to steer this aircraft carrier into a new direction.
That's really helpful to start with that, and I appreciate you kind of both sharing what do we know from research, but also kind of the reflections on that and the nuance to it, because I think that's so important. And so staying though on kind of what is the impact of outcomes-based funding, Kenyatta, I'll turn to you. You've had many roles. You've been part of the work in Tennessee, you've been part of the work in Texas, and now you work nationally and see the work across the country. And as we reflected on, Tennessee, it was the first state in the country to put in place outcomes-based funding. And I would love to hear your reflections as someone who's seen it in Tennessee and also seen it elsewhere. What do you see as the impact of outcomes-based funding in Tennessee and then also elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, the impact you highlighted in the data in terms of what has happened with attainment for the state of Tennessee, and there are intangibles around the cultural shifts that you can see in all parts of the state. The one that really gives me the most encouragement moving forward is the metrics that forced partnerships across institutions, whether it was related to transfer or dual credit. I think institutions over that period since 2010 had to reimagine their role, their regional role, and how they partner with other institutions to achieve their outcomes. And I think that's an important piece. And just connecting to where we're honored to partner with Sean and their work of supporting multiple states and sort of embarking on this value and ROI framework goal, and obviously relating to outcomes funding, is that partnerships now are no longer within higher education, but those partnerships have to be across agencies and different stakeholders in each region. And I would say, if the metrics are simply just around what we need to do as an institution, great. But I don't think that really transforms what the state can produce. It's when you start to see these partnerships evolve, new innovations sort of emerge across multiple, whether it's K through 12, workforce development, 2 year to 4 year, or the TCATs. When you start to see these new things emerge, then you can see sort of a changed behavior, a new culture in the state that gives new possibilities to, policymakers and also to employers, and especially to students.
Thank you for that, Kenyatta. And I'm excited to continue seeing some of those impacts as we continue to talk about this. Ray, let's talk about Texas. And y'all have put in place a lot of kind of innovative changes to your formula and how you've thought about it. And and one of the things that I would love to hear you reflect on a little bit is about the addition of credentials of value as a key priority that was introduced as part of that formula. And so could you share with us kind of what spurred that addition to the formula, and what impact has it had so far in Texas? And
Yeah,
what do you see on the horizon there?
yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we can probably look back, like Tennessee and many other states. Texas has, over the past 20, 30 years, adopted higher education strategic plans, right? So in the year 2000, Texas adopted a plan called Closing the Gaps, and it was primarily focused on increasing access to a post-secondary credential for all students who want to enter post-secondary. So it was an access-focused 15-year strategic plan. In 2015, we shifted to what we call 60 by 30 TX, and that was 60% post-secondary attainment for 25 to 64-year-olds in Texas by the year 2030. And that was our 15-year plan through the year 2030. And so that was more of a focus, not so much on access, that always remains important, but it became a focus on, in a sense, retention. What do we need to do to build scaffolding around students to ensure that they not just matriculate, but that they graduate with a credential? That's what we put in place in 2015. In 2020, a new commissioner of higher education for our state came in, and I had the privilege of serving as one of his deputy commissioners. And we revised our 15-year plan, 60 by 30 TX, and we revised it by including credentials of value. So what we did is we called it Building a Talent Strong Texas, which is our strategic plan that's been adopted by our legislature that's in place today. And we added this element of credential of value. And what we said is we need to demonstrate that the credential, so it's not just a question of access or retention. Now we're looking at the full continuum of the higher education experience. We want students to matriculate, we want students to graduate, but when they graduate, we want to ensure that students have a credential that has economic mobility. And that has become our focus. So looking at credentials of value into the community college formula really began back in 2020 when we began to think about what does a credential of value mean to our state. We thought about it theoretically, we looked at it, we talked to different states about what they were thinking about the notion, but we operationalized it, I think, really for the first time into the community college finance formula that we call House Bill 8 that was adopted by our legislature in 2023. So what does that mean? For our formula, it's a pretty simple formula. What we do is we attach a dollar amount to essentially four different outcomes, four different metrics. And the first is a credential of value. So if you confer a credential of value, whether it's a workforce education level 1 or level 2 certificate, or whether it is an associate degree in criminal justice, there is a dollar amount attached to that credential of value. Second, there's a higher dollar amount attached to a credential of value in a high need or high demand occupational pathway. So there is essentially a premium for conferring a credential of value in those high demand occupational pathways, as defined essentially by our Workforce Commission, by our SHIO, by our coordinating board, with input from our community colleges. The third metric is transfer. If a student completes 30 semester credit hours at a community college and transfers to a four-year university in Texas, whether public university or an independent college, there is a dollar amount attached to that transfer for the college. That's the third metric. And the fourth is what we call dual credit, what most other states call dual enrollment. So if a student completes 15 semester credit hours of dual credit or dual enrollment through a community college, that is a fundable outcome. There is a dollar amount attached to that outcome, and therefore it is conferred to the college when that happens. Those are the primary metrics. I mean, that is our formula. And then I heard you talk about focus population categories for Tennessee. I think that's what we would call, what we kind of call our plus subcategories, but our focus population are students who are economically disadvantaged or low income, students who are academically disadvantaged, and students who are adult learners defined as 25 years of age and older when you confer the credential. The more you do for those focus populations, the more funding you get. So if a student gets an associate degree in criminal justice, but they are a low income, academically disadvantaged student, and maybe even an adult learner, there is additional funding that goes to the college based upon the accumulation of those particular categories. That's our formula. 95% of our state funding to our community colleges is now based upon the formula that I just laid out for you. 5% of formula funding or general revenue that comes to our sector is reserved for a new thing that we created through House Bill 8 to help some of our smaller community colleges, because some of our smaller community colleges don't have the taxing base that a college like Austin Community College has here in Central Texas. So 5% of our formula is reserved to be able to provide some additional funding to some of our more rural-based colleges that may struggle to raise enough money for instruction and operations through the collection of local property taxes. That's it. I mean, that's what we do. And then finally, just to cap this off, we've seen already just 2 years into implementation, we've seen a tremendous uptick in, First of all, there are different ways to measure success, and we're still relatively new, of course, into our formula. It is a work in progress. We're making changes, and Kenyatta and his team at ESG are front and center with us as our thought partner, helping us to think through some additional changes around credentials of value and how we operationalize that. But I mean, what we're seeing is a lot of momentum across our colleges. Our enrollment numbers just came out from our SHIO in the past few weeks, and it showed a 6.1% increase in our enrollment across our 50 community colleges. We have now surpassed, we had lost about 11 or 12% of our student population in the height of COVID. We've now made up for that and surpassed our enrollment figures pre-pandemic. That's not the only measure of success, but certainly Texans are responding by enrolling in their community colleges and looking for a credential that we think will have true value. So I don't want to get on a soapbox for too long, Mary Cypress, but hopefully that gives an overview of what we're doing here in Texas.
No, thank you so much for that, Ray. And it really is helpful, I think, to understand what are those kind of metrics you put in place that you all see in Texas as key levers. Really appreciate that focus on value and you unpacking that for us. I also appreciate the simplicity of it. And obviously that's something that we're thinking about as it relates to Tennessee's formula. We know that there has to be a balance between complexity and simplicity to really take in all of the nuance that comes with a funding formula. But we know that in order for it to really drive focus and strategy change, and even to your point in enrollment patterns, that there has to be some level of simplicity to it to really know what the focus is, what the state's priorities are. Sean, I'd love to turn to you to just talk a little bit about kind of this balance between simplicity and complexity. How can simplicity help drive better outcomes for students? Are there risks to complexities? And how do you balance the two?
Yeah, it's very much an art and a science. I think a good funding formula will always leave out things that you wish could be funded, but just it doesn't make sense, right? Because you try to do too much, you do nothing at all. I told this story recently to Secretary Hargett, so I feel comfortable saying it more widely. But one of the best lessons I ever got was from him early on in my career when we were working on the 2010 version of the funding formula. At some point, we had like all of these different decimal points and whatnot, and he just said, no, stop. Let's simplify it because it needs to be simple in order to be, messaged and sold. And it was a tough lesson, but a helpful lesson to learn how, in order to have a solid funding formula, you have to have, some pretty simple pieces. Russ Deaton, and I'm not sure if he's on the call, always used to say, I want something on an index card. And if it can be on an index card, we can kind of really explain it well. And those types of design thinking, I think, are really important in trying to make sure that you get a solid funding formula, because it's, at the end of the day, not just a way to allocate dollars, it's also a messaging tool. And if you try to put everything in the stew, the message gets lost.
Thanks for that, Sean. And I think that's just a really kind of helpful way to lay that out for us. I'm gonna go back to Ray for one more question, then we're gonna do a closeout question with everybody because I know we're nearing time. But Ray, when we are talking about simplicity, complexity, what are the metrics? What we're really talking about is what are the outcomes we want to see for students, and how can we really encourage institutions to focus on those metrics? And so I'm curious, how have the changes in Texas's formula led to strategy change at the institution level itself?
Yeah. It has across the board. There's no question about that. Our institutions, some for better, but sometimes with challenges. And so, one of the things that has occurred for my association, for example, we're pretty small nonprofit. We've got about 17 full-time employees, and half of our employees work in our Success Center, which is mostly focused on implementing guided pathways and working with success coaches and academic advisors at our campuses. So our team has shifted into a lot of technical assistance, where we mostly are a policy-oriented advocacy team what we've really done over the past 2 years is to partner with external organizations, or particularly with our SHIO, with our coordinating board, in convening either virtually or in person many different technical assistance sessions where we're talking about the formula and helping our colleges to operationalize the formula. We have 50 community college districts in Texas, but a little more than half are classified as either small or medium. So that means a college, about nine of our colleges have less than 5,000 student population and are located in relatively rural parts of the state. So, and yet they need to implement this new formula in the same way that Austin Community College or Dallas College does, or Lone Star, one of our largest community colleges there in the Houston area. So what we've done is a lot of technical assistance with all of our colleges, but particularly our smaller and medium-sized colleges who may not have the people and financial resources to be able to shift as quickly as other colleges. And the other thing to keep in mind, you know, under the new formula now, we are funding many short-term credentials that previously might have been classified under a continuing education portfolio for a college, and were not being reported up systematically to any particular central source, if you will. That's not unique to Texas. I think across the country, most of our community colleges do not systematically report up occupational skills awards or other short-term credentials. Well, now many of those became fundable and have a dollar amount attached to them under our new formula. So it has been a challenge for some of our colleges to be able to put their arms around all of that data and begin to systematically report that in. But we're overcoming those challenges. To get to your question, Mary Cypress, we are overcoming those challenges, and we're seeing tremendous progress. We're seeing all of this is public. We've increased transparency across the board so that our institutions have knowledge and information to help drive their decision making, but even more importantly, so that students have that information so that they know what wage and employment outcomes they're going to be leading to based upon a particular occupational path. We have a lot of data gaps that we're still trying to address. It's not perfect yet, but that's the work that we're continuing to try to do. And then across our colleges, you know, there are great examples. There's always been strong partnerships with local business and industry or regional business and industry, but all of that has been amplified because of House Bill 8 and our new outcomes-based formula. We have true partnerships. We have business and industry coming in, not just helping to supply the equipment for various skills-based training, but also help to develop curriculum along with our colleges. That's not unique. That's been happening for decades, for years, if not decades, in many community colleges. But there was an accelerant put upon it by the passage of our outcomes-based funding model, and we're seeing great results from that across the board. Our increase in enrollment, by the way, is driven by two factors primarily. Number one, dual credit enrollment has really spiked up across our 50 community college districts. And number two, workforce education enrollment. Our career and technical education side of our colleges really has increased as well. So a lot of positive things happening, but still a work in progress that we're trying to refine our formula and make sure that it works for our state.
Thanks so much for that, Ray. And we have institutions in Tennessee doing great work looking at data and responding to these things as well. But we know that any change will require kind of the right supports and rethinking to ensure that that can continue. So it's helpful to hear how that's looked in Texas. So I want to do a quick 30-second each lightning round to close out our panel. And we'll start in the same order we did before, but would love to hear each of you just share kind of what is your one bold recommendation and hope for Tennessee as we approach this funding formula review cycle here. And Kenyatta, we'll start with you.
Oh, that's a tough one because I'm so close in on it, but you're giving me 30 seconds, so I'll have to go. I think if anything, I would just love to see some incentives related to how institutions are partnering regionally. And because Tennessee has nine regions where all of the agencies already are aligned with that, I think instead of creating where Texas has a tri-agency that's policy, mandated by policy to have this table, I think if the state were to think about what those nine regions could produce, whether it's economic development goals, workforce development goals, if there's some incentive there, even if it's a qualitative data point, I think it would be important for the state to think about further transformation and improvement.
Thanks, Kenyatta. Ray?
Well, and just very quickly, I mean, I would go back to the simplicity of our formula. Every state has to do it that's unique to their state. There's no question about that. But I do think that when we studied other states, we came away with the idea that what was going to work for Texas was going to be a formula that was pretty straightforward. Here's what we prioritize. We prioritize credentials of value. You need to demonstrate economic mobility for that credential. We prioritize transfer. We want to see more transfer with our 36 public four-year universities in particular and our many independent colleges. And we really value dual enrollment or dual credit here in Texas. That's what we're paying for, and that's what we're seeing great results in. It's a pretty simple formula. Again, it has to be unique to every state, but that has worked well for us.
Thank you. Sean, close us out.
Oh gosh, I would co-sign everything. So I'm gonna try to come up with something different in the next 20 seconds, and that would be probably figuring out how to help institutions project outwards and plan from a financial perspective. And so making sure that as the formula comes together, building in stability, building in ways and tools to kind of be able to say if we go up by this amount and they go up by this amount, what will our funding be? Just so that institutions have that sense of stability and ability to plan over years.
Thank you, Sean. I think all of that is really important. And I'm just grateful for the three of you for kind of sharing your experiences and your expertise and your background with us. So thank you all for being with us today. As we close out here, we are really excited at SCORE about the opportunity for there to be greater connections between a student's education experience and economic opportunity. And we believe the outcomes-based funding formula is one way that can really help to drive and seal that by better connecting higher education funding with economic opportunity. And so if you want to read more about the recommendations SCORE has for how to do that, this memo here in the middle that you all should have received already, but really helps to outline that for us. If you want to know more about how we're defining impact credentials here in Tennessee, the report on the right can do that. And then I would also invite you to join SCORE for our annual State of Education report release on December 3rd here in Nashville, but you can also tune in virtually where we will talk about many priorities, but including higher education funding as well. Thank you all for being with us today, and we look forward to partnering with you all in the future.